The assembly of the multi-piece center pole will take approximately 1 hour. When performing any cutting during assembly, please wear the appropriate safety equipment, including eye protection. Step 5. We will need to cut the threaded rod P6 to the length of center pole section P2 minus 4 inches. Mark the appropriate length on the threaded rod with a marker and cut using your saw. Next, we will do the same for threaded rod P7, except this time the formula will be the length of P2 minus 8 inches. Discard the extra pieces of both P6 and P7 after making your cuts. Step 6. For this step, you will need threaded rod P6, centering ring P3, 4 hex nuts P8, and pole base plate D. Start by threading a hex nut onto the rod approximately 6 inches from the end. Then slide on the centering ring followed by a second hex nut using a wrench to tighten. Next, thread a third hex nut onto the rod approximately 3 inches from the end. The fourth hex nut should be threaded onto the opposite end of the rod approximately 6 inches from the end. Next, screw the rod into the pole base plate. If you encounter resistance, you may need to file the cut ends of the threaded rod. Use your wrench on the hex nut above the centering ring to tighten the rod into the base. Once the rod hits the bottom of the base, tighten the first hex nut against the base to fully secure it. Step 7. We will start by drawing a center line on both pole splices P4. Since they measure 12 inches in length, we will make a mark at 6 inches. Next, we will screw one of our pole splices onto the top of the threaded rod P6 until the center line mark matches the length of center pole section P2 above the top of the base plate. Secure the pole splice in place by tightening the hex nut P8 against the bottom. Step 8. Next, slide center pole section P2 over the top of pole splice P4 until it rests against the base plate. Step 9. Screw a hex nut P8 onto threaded rod P7 approximately 3 inches from the end. Then screw the threaded rod into pole splice P4 approximately 1 inch and tighten the hex nut against the splice. At this point, it may be easier to lay the assembled pole across your sawhorses or on the floor for the remaining steps. Thread a second hex nut onto the end of the threaded rod approximately 3 inches down. Screw the second pole splice P4 onto the top of the threaded rod until the height of the centerline mark above the top edge of the bottom center pole section P2 is equal to the length of the second section of P2 center pole. Secure the second pole splice in place by tightening the hex nut against it. Step 10. Next, slide the middle center pole section P2 over pole splice P4 until it rests tight against the bottom center pole section. If this section does not slide smoothly over the splice, you may need to lightly file the inside edge of the center pole to increase its clearance tolerance. Step 11. Thread a hex nut P8 onto threaded rod P5, approximately 3 inches from the end. Screw the threaded rod into the top of the pole splice P4 until the rod is exactly 58 3/4 inches from the edge of the pole splice. Tighten the hex nut against the pole splice. Next, we need to thread a hex nut P8 onto threaded rod P5, approximately 6 inches from the end. Then, slide on the second centering ring P3, followed by a second hex nut, and tighten into place. Step 12. Now you're ready to slide the upper center pole section P1 over centering ring and pole splice P4, twisting until it rests tight against the top edge of the middle pole section P2. Step 13. Slide center pole top plate P9 over the top of the threaded rod P5 and secure in place using hex nut P8. If you have more than a half inch of the rod extending beyond your top plate, you should trim it using a saw so that it does not interfere with the installation of the center pole cap later on. This concludes the assembly of the multi-piece center pole.